We meet on this country in the spirit of reconciliation. As we come together today, we acknowledge the rich history of this land and offer recognition and respect for the custodians who have lived here continuously for many centuries. We acknowledge elders of the past who have created the history, those who are with us in the present to lead us forward, and the elders and leaders who will guide us in the future. For all embody the memories, traditions and cultures that are vital to preserving connections to this land. We acknowledge and offer greetings to First Nations people from everywhere in Australia, to those on country bounded by sea, to those from the Red Interior, to those who dwell amongst magnificent forests, and to the many who live in cities across this land. Central Queensland University Australia acknowledges the significance and strength of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island cultures and their place in the expression of an inclusive national society. Thank you for coming together today on Country.
All right, welcome to the launch event for the Festival of Change. My name is Ashley Clark. I work in CQ University's Office of Social Innovation as a Program Manager. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all dialing in from today. I'm dialing in from Naarm, and I would like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land I'm on. I'd also like to pay respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. So welcome to the annual Festival of Change. The Festival of Change is a learning festival facilitated by CQ University, and over the next 2 weeks, CQU campuses will come alive. We host various events online and on campus to celebrate our commitment to social innovation and change making. And today I am honoured to be hosting this panel discussion, Breaking Barriers, as the launch event for the Festival of Change. So Australia claims to value a fair go, and access to tertiary education is vital for a fair, equitable and inclusive society. But discrimination on the basis of race, culture, disability, neurodivergence, gender, disadvantage and distance still creates barriers to educational attainment. So how can tertiary education lead the way in breaking barriers inside our institutions, but also across our communities? I'm joined by a wonderful panel who are here to share their lived experience, call out injustice, and recognise the systemic needs for structural and systems change, and hopefully map a few priorities that they see for meaningful change. So welcome to the panel, Melinda Mann.
Good afternoon, Ashley, and good afternoon, everyone.
Sam Drummond.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Professor Kate Ames.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here.
And CJ Tom. So in pursuit of a fair, equitable and inclusive society, it's important to recognise that barriers exist. When we practice social innovation, we always spend time deeply understanding the problem that we're trying to solve, rather than just trying to jump to solutions. So I'd really like to start by taking a moment and inviting each panel member to share what they see as the most significant barriers in the context of tertiary education. And Dr. Melinda Mann, we might start with you. You are an advocate for Indigenous nation building, Pacific sovereignties and regional and rural communities, and you have a background in student services, learning design, community organising and academic research. So I'd love to ask you, in your view, what are some of the most significant injustices or barriers that exist within our tertiary system?
Sure, thanks Ashley for the question. I'm a Darumbal and South Sea Islander woman, and so I just want to pay my respects to Darumbal country where I'm on today, and to the country and the custodians of country where everyone else who's online are at today. So so this is such a big question, and I think that to understand injustice within the tertiary education system, and I'll speak specifically about the higher education sector because that's where my experiences have been for a while now. I think that we have to remember why universities were established in the first place. The foundational universities, certainly in this country, have persisted to and influenced new institutions like ours and the entire sector now for generations. These foundational institutions and those which have been established since were built on the premise that there are certain people who are the knowers, and that there are those who are determined, or which are determined to be incapable of knowing or even learning. And I reference Professor Chelsea Wadigo's work articulating the experiences of Indigenous academics in universities. So universities, you know, they kind of have this this tendency to take stereotypes and assumptions, and especially about race, and turn that into knowledge. And that's the power of this process of knowledge creation, which is why universities exist in the first place. So we've seen how this ideology actually results in pathologizing and problematizing of Indigenous and people all over the world, and enslaved people. So we've been subjects of collection, examination, experimentation, and even decoration, which is because we've been deemed as not human. And this is at the heart of the injustice with the sector. So there are universities all over the world that insist on retaining the remains of Indigenous people in their faculties, inside their buildings. There's an estimated 108,000 Indigenous people held in United States museums and universities. And that was as at 2022, which was about 30 years after the US government instructed universities and museums and other agencies to give those Indigenous people back to their families. And Australian universities aren't any different, and their sister institutions, museums, continue to hold on to Indigenous people here. And there are ongoing efforts all the time by Indigenous people and Indigenous groups, as well as agencies, government agencies, to repatriate. There's in excess of 10,000 Indigenous people held in universities in the United Kingdom, as well as museums in the United Kingdom. So this is what I mean when I say that the foundation for universities in this country was built on the knowers of Indigenous people, because of course we were incapable of knowing ourselves. So this fundamental premise of who is the knower and who is deemed incapable of knowing or learning has led to ongoing injustices and barriers across the sector, where we continue to see specific groups of the population, not just Indigenous people, underrepresented at university. And so two of those barriers, First Nations people, participation and completion, as well as knowledge creation. And these are highlighted in a Commonwealth Review of Higher Education Access and Outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people back in 2012. So the first Indigenous student was admitted to university in the 1960s or early 1960s, which was Charles Perkins. But we really didn't see rates of Indigenous student admissions rise until the 1990s. And in 2012, we were still below parity, sitting at about 2.2% of the domestic higher education student population, and now even lower than that at around 1.9%. And in terms of the role of knowledge creation with universities, the call for First Nations cultural competency across the sector was kind of first sounded by the Universities Australia in 2011, when they issued the best practice framework for Indigenous cultural competency in our universities. So that, but an impetus for the cultural competency framework for Australian universities was the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991. So Universities Australia recognised that the role of the sector must be to produce graduates with the skills and the attributes to address social justices, health injustices, and even the injustices that are perpetrated by the justice system. So I think that injustices that exist within the sector, certainly for Indigenous people, is rooted in its foundation. And just like roots, they're complex and they're deep. And certainly from my perspective, how universities position themselves as producers of knowledge about Indigenous people and Indigenous lands is a site for contest. But it's also the place where opportunity for coexistence is as well. So yeah, that's my take on where injustice and how injustice kind of plays out for Indigenous people within the higher education sector.
Thank you so much, Melinda. And look, we've had a few conversations prior to this, and I think that we could go deep into some of the things that you've highlighted just now. I think, yeah, there's some really important points, and I'd love to circle back in a minute just to the concept of cultural competency and what that looks like, particularly in your work. So thank you for kicking us off. Sam, I might move to you. You've just launched your memoir, Broke, which takes a look at disability, non-traditional families and rural disadvantage. Can you share a little bit about your own experience growing up and how higher education helped or hindered you to get to where you are today?
Yeah, certainly. I grew up in country Victoria and really in a single parent family, and really made it a goal to see that university avenue as a route out of the situation that I was in, and was very, very lucky to be in a public schooling system that allowed me to do that. Some people got left behind at high school, but there were some outstanding teachers who really identified kids who really wanted to have a go of things and allowed us to do that. But then when I moved to, I got into law school in the city, and it was a real culture shock. There were, for one, if I was going to live on campus, it would have taken about more than 100% of my income. So just trying to get that rental property or that share house was a struggle in itself. And then I got to university and the people were different than me. For one, they didn't have a physical disability like I did. The vast majority were able-bodied people, but it was the background that they'd come to, which was the real barrier. So these were people who were largely private schooled. Many had family connections with the legal industry. So not only did they know the names of the big firms, like as I didn't, but they'd already had internships there. They already had connections and this dirty word of networking that I got used to. And their parents might have been paying for them to live on campus. So they had all these social networks that I just didn't have a go at. So that was this system that was created from day one at university was against me. And to Melinda's point, I made friends with a guy who had come over. He was probably about my age now or younger, but he was a guy from Northwest Western Australia, and that cultural shock hit him more, and he lasted 6 months. So we can try and get the numbers better about, you know, having more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or more people with disabilities, or more people from regional areas into our big universities. But until we start changing that culture to accept them at university, then those barriers are still going to exist. I think we have this myth at the moment that university can be the great cultural equalizer, and it's true to an extent, but only if we implement it in the right way. And my experience was that when we're not doing that from day one, and it wasn't until I started forming networks from outside of university that allowed me, for example, to get a job, or to volunteer at a legal service that gave me that that I started experiencing that. And so preparing our universities to think differently about those different backgrounds, because it certainly wasn't that for me. But now I look back at some of my old lecturers and I'm still in touch with them, and the way that they operate, I understand that now in a way that I didn't understand that when I first went into university.
Thanks, Sam. I completely hear you on redesigning or a need to redesign the system itself to be truly inclusive, and to not necessarily expect the individual to be able to kind of fit into something that doesn't necessarily suit everyone. So there's a huge conversation we need to have around that. Kate, I might just move to you. You are the Director for Learning Design and Innovation at CQ's, in CQ's Tertiary Education Division, which is a very important position. But in our discussions, you've highlighted a passion for ensuring that higher education is accessible for people who are neurodivergent. So I'd love if you could share a little bit about why you're passionate about this and highlight some of the barriers that you see within our tertiary system.
Thanks, Ashley, and hello, everybody. I'm on Mununjali country here, south of Jimboomba in Queensland, so I just want to acknowledge that I am on these traditional lands. Look, I have been passionate about equity and access for a long period of time. I started my career really in online education and have done that for the last couple of decades, really. And in that journey, the question about how do we make everybody central to their experience in the classroom has always been part of that question. And particularly in the early days of distance education, where you would see, these recorded lectures, because we would record the lecture on campus, and then the poor person out on the, in online land would have to see poor quality tapes and not be able to ask questions. And I mean, there's a long list. So now that we've come an awful long way, because we're having these conversations about how do we be inclusive of everybody in the classroom. But the core principle is that people shouldn't have to advocate for themselves to be represented. It should be systemic. And so as a cultural sociologist in my background, I'm inherently interested in systems and processes. So if we take that premise, how do you help people be central to the classroom? That is the underlying foundational principle for everyone. Now, with regard to the specific interest in neurodivergence, interestingly enough, I started that journey working with the accessibility team here in central Queensland when we, during COVID, saw particular issues with students who had dyslexia. And I worked with one of my amazing colleagues, Chris, from our accessibility team, to create an online short course in dyslexia, because there was an issue with dyslexia in the classroom. So that started a very specific journey. And then interestingly enough, it came to my family. So my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD, and I had seen the struggle in the classroom. And then my personal and professional lives converged, and I started doing research in adult diagnosed ADHD, and then listening to the qualitative stories, story after story after story after story, talked about these very, very joyous but sad journeys, where there is this theme of shame, guilt, trauma, having to advocate for themselves, being told that they were stupid, feeling that they were stupid. And interestingly enough, there's a theme that, they kind of figured something was wrong in primary school, managed to make it through high school. And then when they got to their first year of university, that's when everything just literally collided on them, because they had lost their structure and so on. So that is why I am particularly interested at the moment in neurodivergence, and it's a theme for those who work with me. It's on every theme, because it's underreported, underdiagnosed. It comes with a whole sense of stigma, shame, lack of knowledge, lack of accuracy, and so on. And so the question for me with regard to those is they're invisible. And I don't necessarily want to term them as disabilities, because it's a condition, and there's a lot of contestation about what neurodivergence is. I also have lived experience with disability, because many people might know my brother is quadruple amputee, and so having to just walk around the city into buildings, etc., that constantly having to move chairs, ask questions, can we go here, can we go there? It's exhausting. So I am very lucky that I am in a position where I can ask the questions and really challenge processes and bring the question about how do we make change at a very central level, ranging from, curriculum design, too many forms, assessment design, exams, all of that sort of stuff. It's a really, really big question about how do we make things better and easier for people to be able to move through our systems from admission, being in class, sitting in an online or on-campus class, doing assessment, graduating, all of that sort of stuff, without having to advocate for themselves so that it's easy. And that is a really big challenge at every level. So yeah, just actually having it on the agenda is, for me, it feels very important.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think that leads really beautifully into the question that I have for you, CJ. I know that you're really passionate about ensuring that lived experience is front and centre when we are designing solutions. Can you tell us a little bit about your own lived experience and some of the common challenges you've observed or experienced regarding kind of barriers in tertiary education? CJ, we can't hear you.
Sorry, there were 2 mute buttons. Thanks, Ash, and thank you, Kate. I actually really resonate with the topics you're discussing, and actually that hyper-flexible model really resonates with me as a person with ADHD. Whilst I did, the only way I could describe it is stumbling my way through my undergraduate degrees. My most recent attempt to tackle my master's was the only way to describe it is actually quite a traumatic experience where I'd been at work all day, new job, and was presenting I was the last cab off the rank to present at 9 p.m. at night after a day of work in a highly lit room, very overstimulated, a bit overwhelmed, quite heightened, and obviously nervous for speaking. And that inhibited my performance, obviously, and it was not a great outcome. And at the end of the day, did leave me feeling quite almost defeated. And I think that's sort of why I took a step back from that. I'm now in a space where I don't necessarily need that to progress my career, but it's such an important area. And I think it's really important to really emphasize that lived experience is such a multifaceted area. And it's really important that I reinforce that the lived experience I talk about represents the communities that I identify with, not a lived experience box that you can tick to say, yes, that person has some form of lived experience. So my lived experience is as a proudly and openly queer person. I'm a first in family to attend university and to finish high school from a pretty significantly low socioeconomic background, and a person with mental illness and neurodivergence as well. I'm also a carer. And I'm incredibly proud of my roots in Central Queensland. I was born in Monto and I grew up in Bundaberg in Queensland. So I naturally have a pretty soft spot for CQ Uni and some of the work that I see in community. I also used to work for CQ Uni. But for me, I think if I revert back to sort of when I was in my undergraduate space, I was very lucky to be awarded an equity scholarship. Now, that scholarship saw me financially able to attend university. My family's circumstances at the time, they lost their business in the 2010-2011 floods. There was no way that I was going to be able to get to university. So I was very lucky to be awarded an equity scholarship with the university of my choice. And without that, there was no way that I would get through that front door. But I think what really separated success for me from failure was the community then that was intentionally and very strategically built around this scholarship that really celebrated students essentially that identify from within the margins. And I think that made all the success because it was this massive cultural shift in, rather than the 2% sort of, you're lucky to be here, it's actually you are front and center. And that cultural shift is so important in that the culture around, being awarded an equity scholarship at times is quite stigmatizing as well, historically, but rather that shift in almost celebrating it. And I'm sure, and I do know from again having worked with CQU that the outcomes are the same, in that students that are awarded equity scholarships have a higher rate of completion than mainstream cohorts. They have a higher rate of coming back and re-engaging in even higher levels of education. And then you look at the career progression, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I am very lucky to have had that, and I can hand over my heart say that I would not be in the position I am today without that. I think it was at the time back in the day, about $3,500. That $3,500 that I got to get me moved from Bundaberg to Brisbane is the difference between, breaking the cycle and not.
Thank you so much, CJ. That's a really important point. And yeah, there's so many things in what you just said, but I think one thing that stood out to me is, the support system that you mentioned that really kind of rallied around you. And it's interesting, in the social impact space or social innovation space, we work a lot with social enterprises, and really successful social enterprises often have kind of inbuilt support systems to make sure that the beneficiaries or the people that they're designing for, or serving, that they are supported in the ways in which they truly need. And we often talk about, are universities a social enterprise? I think some are and some aren't. FYI, CQ is the first social enterprise accredited by Social Traders. But for those reasons that you just mentioned, it does come back to a lot of the wraparound services that we provide our students who might not otherwise have it. In any system, there are a number of components or parts that work together to keep the system going. So these might be people or objects or relevant elements such as, policies or procedures or people in positions of power, as we've said. And often these elements are interconnected and complex, and that's why systems change can be really, really difficult. And higher education is no different. It's a big, complex, messy system with people, processes, policies, practice perpetuating the way it functions. And that might be positive or it might be negative. Sam and Melinda, I would love to throw it to you. I'd love to hear a little bit about when you think about the higher education system, what are some of the factors that you believe perpetuate disadvantage and injustice? And again, I know it's a big question, and I'll leave it to whoever wants to answer first.
Melinda, maybe I'll take it first. I'm sure some thinking time would be nice. I think there are two things for me here, and I really appreciate CJ and Kate bringing this up because, and this is coming from now recently lapsed lawyer practicing in discrimination law, but also see it working in human rights advocacy in my current role. But when we talk about disability, we often think about putting in a ramp in a university and then suddenly it's all accessible. But in the last few years, we've really seen that supercharge into what the discussion around what disability is, and the complaints that have come to my table about disability discrimination in higher education have largely been around non-visible disabilities, in particular neurodivergence. And I think when universities get this wrong, it can absolutely perpetuate disadvantage of people with autism or ADHD or any other physical disability or non-visible disability. So classrooms and education needs to be centered around not just making sure that there's a ramp, but that also our online systems are accessible, our the physical environment is accessible, and talking to people about their experience and asking from the very beginning, what can we do to make sure that you get the most out of your university experience? The other thing that I'd say in particular around this idea of disability is that the employment of people with disability is a real hot topic. Because if we look at the stats around people with disabilities getting employment, around half of people with disabilities have around half the employment rate. When we are employed, we get paid about half as much. And so for people in universities, where it's sometimes tempting to just go on a never-ending journey of study, and that there is benefit in that. Like, I think I would have loved to do that. But sometimes it's because there are no jobs out there. And so we need to be looking at pathways out of university as well as within the system. And I know that's fraught because I studied arts law at university. I majored in philosophy. I just loved being in the university thinking about theoretical things. But there has to be a balance as well. And so universities do have a role in preparing people for life beyond universities if that's what they want, and not get stuck in the cycle of never-ending degrees when that's not actually what they want out of their experience. Melinda, maybe I'll hand it over to you at that point as well.
That was a really good explanation there. I think Sam addressed quite a few types of barriers that the system throws at everyone, at a lot of different people, and not just people with disability, but that those issues around access and affordability, and those are quite common experiences for Indigenous people as well. I think one of the other things, and I'll just be brief about this, is that I think the universities get in their own way when it comes to addressing or perpetuating these barriers. So universities, I think, are still learning that they are part of the system, Like I mentioned before, museums are part of the system. There's memory institutions, like libraries and archives, and as well as levels of government, systems of like the health system and the criminal justice system. Those are all parts of it's one system, and university is core to that, because it's the place where the professionals come from. So for me, I think, and I'm going to give cultural competency another plug, because it's not just about having a workforce, which not just teaching or research workforce, but also the professional side of universities that is competent on kind of First Nation stuff. But it's about enabling staff at universities to actually interrogate themselves and their own positions, and what values and what norms they hold on to. And that doesn't just impact First Nations students, but students with disability, students from regional and remote areas, first and family, all of those types of students. When we have staff at universities who understand how they, how they've been informed about the world, what they know is to be true, and just have the tools to be able to challenge that and to kind of pull that thinking apart. So I think universities get in their own way and become a barrier to themselves, but not recognizing that we are part of the system.
I think that it's a really important point you make, Melinda and Sam, around cultural competency, but around, I think, that we are all players and we are all actors within the system, and perpetuate the system in some way, and that might be positively or negatively. And I think I really invite everyone who's on the call today, who's listening, to just think about, the power that you may or may not have, and how you use that power, and whether or not it does, I suppose, lead us towards a more inclusive, tertiary system, or maybe whether that hinders it. So let's move the dial a little bit. I'd like to talk a little bit about strategies and solutions for meaningful change. So achieving change requires collective effort. It requires collaboration, coordination, and alignment, usually amongst a lot of different people with a lot of different agendas, a lot of different goals, a lot of different priorities, a lot of different ways of working. So CJ, I might start with you. In your work at Wellways, you have a focus on co-design and co-production. Can you talk a little bit about this? Yep. And how maybe the tertiary system can learn from that practice?
Yeah, definitely. For those that maybe didn't read the bio, Wellways is a leading mental health service here in Australia. We operate in every state and territory. And here in Queensland, we are the service provider for the Kerra Gateway and sort of Western Sydney, New South Wales. So within that sort of space, and I think for me, I resonate with organisations, programs and services, whether they be community health or universities, where I can see myself in the people that deliver it and the people that make the decisions. And what I mean by that is that really nothing concerns me more than when organisations, particularly those in more Anglo-male dominated industries, which higher ed is definitely one of those, when those that aren't a stakeholder or aren't the primary user lead the discussions around these kinds of topics, when we know the real power is in listening to those that have the experience, that lived experience, and the lived experience that represents that particular cohort or the stakeholder that will be impacted by any decision. Now, this is something that Wellways does really well in ensuring that the people running our services and making the decisions are themselves, or have completed really comprehensive consultation with people who provide or people who benefit from our services. So it's not so much about ticking a box and saying, yeah, we've consulted, or having a seat at the table for someone with lived experience. Where the magic actually happens is where lived experience leads the conversation. So that's the real difference between that co-design versus co-production. Co-design is we're going to collect information and gather your thoughts, and co-production is where you put the control in the hands of the service user. And really, that's where the magic happens. That's where the really powerful stuff happens. And this can be a really challenging concept for more institutional models to master. But when we get it right and we stand back and watch the magic happen, just wow, because that's how organizations like Wellways came to be. Wellways was formed by carers of people with mental illness who saw the institutional model and wanted a better future for their loved ones. And that is the DNA of this organization. Every decision. So Wellways had a really key part in designing the design of the Carer Gateway. And that is what it is today. In Queensland and part of New South Wales, we have 40,000 carers that access our service, because it's carers that designed the program. Yeah, I think we also have a really massive peer workforce as well. So whilst when we talk about peer workforce traditionally, we talk about sort of identified roles, but actually we have those with lived experience of mental illness and of being a carer at every level of the organization, from our board to our executive team to the staff delivering the service on the front line. Now, that does come with its own suite of challenges and additional supports that we as an employer provide to our staff to keep them safe at work, but the outcomes speak for themselves. I think the flexible model, that hyper flexible model that Dr. Ames delivers. Even when I was back working at CQU, it was groundbreaking then. It continues to be groundbreaking, and I think there's a lot to learn from that model. And I would love to see that expanded to more disciplines, because maybe a third crack at my postgraduate degree might be successful if it was a model like that, because what I found was inaccessibility. And I could tell that as going through the model, going through that postgraduate pathway, no one with neurodivergence or many of the other cross sections that I represent had been consulted about the design of that program.
Kate, I might throw to you. I would love to hear, drawing from your experiences as Director of Learning, Design and Innovation, what are some effective strategies or solutions that you've seen or implemented yourself that have created meaningful change?
Look, thanks, Ashley. I'd really like to draw on just the conversation that Sam, Melinda and Christopher have provided. And I'll just provide an example to illustrate, I think, some of the things that we're talking about here. So at the moment, one of the current issues in the sector is artificial intelligence and academic integrity and the impact that it's going to have within the tertiary sector. So we're investigating institutionally and sector-wide, how do we address that in the, we'll go back to exams. Well, don't get me started on those. I'll just park my views on exams off to the side. So one of the conversations that we were having was, we might go Vivas. Let's think about Vivas. So, or Vivas, or however anyone would like to pronounce them. But they are basically verbal articulations of knowledge where you are under questions. Long tradition in the sector. We don't necessarily do them well. And we've often talked about finding better ways to create authentic ways for people to represent learning. But if I can just touch on neurodiversity, there is not a lot of knowledge and research about how neurodiverse people at adult level in the learning environment respond to different kinds of assessment. But what we do know is that ADHD people have trouble in articulating clear responses to an elicited question. So if we know that, and we're going, let's do Vivas, we are already disadvantaging, by nature of what seems to be a good idea, some people in our classroom who may or may not know that they have that condition or have been diagnosed with that condition. And that's just one subset of a group. Then you've got anxiety, you've got depression, you've got people with a disability, etc. So the first thing is to question our privilege and our knowledge. That's the first thing, is to go, okay, it seems like a great idea, but let's just go back to the evidence and think about how everybody is going to react. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do them. What it might mean is you really question why we're doing this assessment, or what specific skills we may need to be teaching students. Now, to be teaching everybody how to interpret a question and how to clearly articulate an answer to a question might actually be targeted towards your ADHD person who's in the classroom. It's going to help everybody though. You know, the same thing with those conversations about time management. Just be a better time manager. You need to get on top of your time management. For someone who's neurodivergent, time looks different, but actually really specifically articulating how to do that, again, isn't going to disadvantage everybody, but it may advantage specifically people with neurodivergence in the classroom. Being more inclusive of people with a disability, making doors, you know, rooms wider, halls wider, making doors easier to open is going to help everybody, not just somebody with a disability. And same with First Nations people, including First Nations knowledge into the classroom or into a curriculum isn't going to disadvantage anybody. It's about how do we do it. So I think really that question of challenging our privilege and our assumptions, making sure we are doing research and evidence based. You know, if I had $1 for every time it's just an opinion within the environment, you know, oh, do you think we should do exams, or do you think we should do this? I don't know, go to the research. Actually, there's a whole heap of scholarship on that. How about you go and have a look at that and come back and we'll have a discussion. So really driving people to be evidence informed and really thinking about this, but always having that question, I think really is critically important, particularly when we are looking at significant disruption in the sector. So just that's that piece. In terms of what have we done, I think many universities are really conscious of this and really trying to work very hard, but we do need to make sure that we're not othering and doing these things on the side to help particular cohorts or to address a particular problem, because it's easier to do that than really challenge the system. The hyperflexible stuff is a really great example. That is disruptive. Internationally, there are some really great examples, particularly in America, where there's some, you know, hyperflexible options, a little bit different to the one that we've got at CQ University. But that brings with it its challenges. You know, some people actually need a deadline and structure. Some people really get challenged by pressure. So again, it's never one size fits all, but certainly we've had a lot of feedback where we've had students, beautiful emails from students saying, I have a disability, or I'm a young mother I'm stuck in a rural property or whatever, and I just can't access education, and thank you, this has made a really big difference. Things like really taking universal design for learning very seriously, reviewing curriculum to see, you know, representation, is it accurate in the classroom? You know, so there is a fair bit of that. And then really, again, the cost. We have residential schools, we have textbooks, we've got all of those things that we think we're helping students, but actually timetabling, you know, setting a timetable at 8 o'clock in the morning in a metropolitan city, when in fact for someone who's living on the fringes, to use public transport, get your child to childcare, turn up in class at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning is not physically possible. So really thinking deeply about everything we're doing and trying our best to you know, to maximize you know, the opportunity for everybody. I remember in my other life, I have a military background, and I remember one of the best leaders I ever worked for scheduled meetings, core meetings, only between 10 and 2, because that was guaranteed that everybody would be there, including members of the part-time workforce. And I remember thinking it was a little bit ironic that that window was in that environment that people might think is much more firm in terms of, well, you need to be here at 8 o'clock, but because when people were actually not deployed and were in, they needed to do things like catch up on medicals and go and get their, you know, family sorted and squared away. And so that ended up just being a really particularly inclusive practice, which meant nobody missed out. There wasn't an 8 o'clock meeting that people weren't attending, and, you know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon meeting that people were missing out on. So it's really simple things like that that you can do that can make a really big difference. I could talk all day, so I will will be quiet. But yeah, I think there's some good stuff happening, but there's really, really big challenges, and we need to question every bit of our practice all the time.
Thank you, Kate. I think a really important point there is, it can seem really big, and it is really big, but it can also be really simple, such as timetabling, and I know, I'm based at our Melbourne campus and we have a lot of international students, and, if we're scheduling things in the time that they need to work in order to survive in one of the most expensive cities in our country, then they're not going to be able to, put food on the table if they have to be attending class and kind of meet those things. So really basic stuff can actually, perpetuate some of these barriers. Melinda, we have touched on cultural competency a few times. We are running out of time, but there's so much work that you've been doing around this piece. Could you tell us a little bit about? I think we know that cultural competency is important, but how could the average academic or professional staff member implement cultural competency into their practice, and where can they find more information?
Sure. So just quickly, so the work that the project that I'm involved in with Dr. Gary Fry, we're basically working on implementing the cultural competency framework and the First Nations curriculum framework, which is still in draft. But so we're going through or delivering a series of workshops now from now until the end of the year. So academics are invited to participate in those. They're each fortnight. But what we're looking at there is, basically kind of coaching and facilitating discussions about what cultural competency is to develop staff. So, we're looking at embedding how to embed First Nations pedagogical approaches into teaching, how to privilege First Nations cultures and voices into both research and teaching, how to challenge some of those kind of old antiquated knowledge or stereotypes that have been, kind of perpetuated as knowledge and built around, kind of old thinking about Indigenous people and who is an Indigenous person. So how to kind of, interrogate those constructions of Aboriginality. And looking at, kind of the structural inequality that First Nations people experience. So, that's what cultural competency is about. It's about learning more about, like Kate was just saying, our own practice, our own discipline area, and having some tools to challenge our thinking about our own practice and what our discipline area is actually, doing too, in terms of furthering injustices that are experienced by Indigenous people out in the community. So that's just a little bit about the work that we're doing. So it's kind of we're just hoping to kick that off. Like this effort to develop a culturally competent staff body it has to start somewhere. So we're doing that now, and hopefully that work will develop a bit more into an online course that the staff will be able to participate in, or to go through and then look at how we do that with vet staff and how we do that with professional staff as well. So
I think it sounds like for people in other institutions, I think it starts with just investing in the development of a program like what you're working on at the moment, or a project that you're working on. But I'm really excited to see where that goes. So thank you for sharing. And anyone who's from CQU, make sure that you keep an eye out and you get involved in that training. So we have 8 minutes left. I'm going to stop asking you questions because I could sit here and ask you questions all day, and we are going to go to the Q&A. What changes would you make to universities and their courses, or to tutoring support to make them more accessible?
I'll jump in for 30 seconds and then give to Kate. But I think, we've talked a lot about disability, migrants, neurodiverse people, and to recognize that it's not just one category, but humans are multifaceted, and these are all indicators of disadvantage. There are compounding levels of disadvantage. And what we've talked about in the last sort of 20 minutes is that flexibility is a really good approach to have. And so one method might be good for one person, but it's not going to work for others. So universities who are really giving choice to students about their assessment criteria or how they access materials, whether they're online or on campus, is going to be crucial going into the next few years.
Yeah, look, I think I will add to that, Sam, in terms of that flexibility. You know, you've met one person with a disability and you've met one person with a disability. You know, it really is just so complex, and we bring so much, all of us bring such incredible stories and challenges and reactions to everything we do. So that is a big challenge when you're in a mass education environment where you're looking at things like cost and systems and support, and we've got lots and lots of forms, and you know, you've got to go here and there, and it's getting harder and harder to find a person to talk to. And that includes within our classrooms, where you might be, you know, you might have one unit coordinator, but you've got a separate tutor, and then someone else is marking your stuff, and then you've got an accessibility support person elsewhere, and you know, it's really difficult. And I do wonder sometimes how our students manage to get through, all of them, anyone. So that is something that I don't think there is any simple answer. In terms of examples that are doing really well, I actually think CQ, you know, there are some universities that are doing very well, and it is those students who are, or it's those universities that really have the ability to be a little bit flexible and that are in a position or looking at evaluating their policies. Those universities who've got higher low socioeconomic status students usually, I don't know, that's a big statement, usually do have better flexibility, you know, and support systems. But in terms of specific practice, you know, I couldn't really name one aside from the movement towards universal design for learning in the online system. I think there are many universities that are specifically working, and at CQU we're investing an awful lot of interest in that, you know, closed captioning to support, you know, people with hearing loss, so on. So there is a lot of good work happening. It's just for me about that systemic, so people aren't having to ask and go to their accessibility. Wouldn't it be great if you could actually just have the flexibility to devise your own plan, because many people with a disability or a disorder or a condition already have systems of support in place. Many do actually know what they need and have access to that, particularly if they have an established disability. The issue is, how do they then implement that and line that up and match that up with the classroom expectations?
Thank you. We do have a few other questions in the Q&A, but what I'm going to do, just to make sure that we finish on time, is panel members, if you do have a moment to answer them, you can actually type an answer. So if you would like to answer any of the questions in the Q&A, please type an answer. But to finish, I would like to invite each panel member to just take a moment to reflect on their ideal future state. I think we've spoken a lot about the problem, we've spoken about the systems that exist, and only really some of the factors that perpetuate the system. We know that there are many more. I think we've all really recognized that, you know, we all are players or actors within that system, and it's important that we start to interrogate ourselves and the practices that we're part of. But if you could, you know, design your ideal future state for a tertiary institution, what would that look like? Melinda, I might start with you and then we'll go around the room.
Okay, well, I'm going to just refer back to the Berendt review, which I talked about at the start. So that review actually proposed a future, and I quite like the future that it proposed. And that was one where it would be unremarkable for an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person to aspire to university. So that means that universities have to work on their reputations for being places where Indigenous students are valued and know that they'll be safe here. It also means that, you know, there's the pathways into university very accessible. It's their common knowledge about how to get into university. So that's one thing I think that the sector does at the moment. It's unremarkable for an Indigenous person to come to university, but I think there's still some remarkable, you know, qualities about, or, you know, remarkable achievements when an Indigenous person actually graduates or comes back to do a master's or some kind of postgraduate study. So that was the kind of the first vision for the future that the Berendt Review proposed, and the other one was a vision where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews and perspectives are valued and contribute to Australia's knowledge base. And for me, that means that Indigenous students see themselves, when they're here, they see themselves reflected in the curriculum, in the university curriculum, and the policies that impact them or that they're required to follow. Indigenous support staff, professional staff see themselves reflected as well in those policies. And I think importantly for Indigenous support staff, I think it would be a perfect ideal world if their focus was on recruitment and student wellbeing and career progression instead of actually carrying the cultural competency of an entire institution. And it would be a future where I think Indigenous academics, and lots of them, so recruiting lots of them, are free to actually speak back in terms of the knowledges that have been produced and are still being produced about Indigenous people. So that's the future that I'd like to see.
That's one I'd like to see as well. Thank you. Sam, I might throw to you.
Okay, no, we've just hit 1 o'clock, but I'd really like to see institutions that foster community and create that community around them with alumni from all backgrounds who are caring for the people and the planet that we all live in. That's to put it really simply and quickly.
Thank you so much. Kate?
So just simply, in institutions that are very safe, that are kind and enabling, and everyone feels enabled.
And CJ?
Thank you. I think looking toward that cultural shift and really empowering that the voice of lived experience in, some level of governance and decision and design of future state programs. And I think, where we have policy level barriers or regulatory level barriers, empowering institutions and the people behind them to advocate and create really meaningful change.
Well, on that note, let's hope that this conversation sparks a little bit of inspiration for those who may be within the institution or outside of the tertiary education system to try and either advocate for change or push change or challenge some of those outdated systems that no longer serve us. I do want to thank each panel member for taking the time today. Sam, I know that you may have COVID, so I just really want to give you a huge shout out for, for not being in bed. Thank you. It's been such a wonderful discussion. And yeah, I just really appreciate all of you. The Festival of Change does continue for the next 2 weeks, so please check out our website and all the details for all the upcoming events are there. So thank you, and I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.